Welcome to self-discoverywisdom.com, formerly known as Self-Discovery Media. On these podcasts, you're going to hear people who speak from the heart. They've taken the journey in life. Many things have happened to them, but they've changed it to happening for them. And in their strength, their courage, they've discovered their abilities and their wisdom, and they are now sharing it here with you. Do enjoy each show. We bring it to you with love and knowing that it's going to help you on your journey of life. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of our Global Veterans right here on self-discoverywisdom.com. I'm your host, Sarah Troy. My guest is Robert D. Hicks. We're going to be talking about his book, Wounded for Life, 7 Union Veterans of Civil War. Why are we talking about the Civil War when there's wars going on all around us? Because we do not learn by past wars. We're going to keep repeating them. Lessons need to be learned. He is a former director of the Mütter Museum in Philadelphia and the author of Wounded for Life, the 7 Union Veterans of the Civil War. And in this interview, we're going to talk about the topic relates to all those who are disabled today, including wounded veterans. He also discusses the changing social circumstances of the late 17th and early 20th centuries and how that impacted veterans. Wounded for Life is equal parts Civil War history, disability history, history of the body. The collective experiences of veterans profiled in the book show how they dealt with common expectations of manhood, masculinity, identity after their injuries. Here we're going to share the insights of the era of the history, humanizing and intimate lives of disabled veterans. I'd like to actually use the word differently abled rather than disabled, because when you lose one thing, I think you gain another. So whether it's sight or limbs or something, there's another sense that seems to step up that becomes more heightened. I've interviewed many a veteran who has been differently disabled by something that happened during their fight. And it's what they came back to. And very often it's just simply was not enough. What I've always been fascinated about with the veterans is that they know what they were lacking. And because of their discipline as a soldier and that, what we need is they've created whatever was missing, whatever they needed to support other veterans and other people, that are going through what they're going through. And so it's always been a wonderful thing to see that happen instead of just resting on the laurels of what the government support is, which is generally not enough. Why did you choose to go back to the Civil War to kind of talk about even, to bring it into the current events of today? I'm sure with the Civil War, when people came home, they didn't get any support whatsoever. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Thank you very much. Big topics, big questions. And I share the viewpoint that you've expressed about this. The Civil War, as far as the United States is concerned, is a truly pivotal event, and at least as pivotal as the American Revolution was. The tragedy of that war in destruction, physical destruction of the landscape, destruction of a whole Southern economy was of course there. But the population of the United States today is about 330 million. At the time of the Civil War, it was 33 million. And yet, with that population, at least 750,000 soldiers died. The number is really much higher because it doesn't account for people who died of wounds, say, 3 or 4 years later.
Yeah.
Who definitely died from war-related causes. But that meant that in today's terms, as an equivalence, that would be about 8 to 10 million people dying in a civil war in this country. That's not unnoticed if such a thing should actually happen. And the recovery is still in progress today. On the medical side, it's frequently a caricature of film that they didn't use anesthesia in those days, and chopping off limbs was de rigueur. But the reality was really quite different. And I try to communicate some of that in what I've written in the book, which shows a much more sophisticated medical response to injuries and wounds than people might suspect. Also, anytime people today see a person taken by ambulance to a trauma care center, to emergency room in a hospital. They are seeing American Civil War medicine because the system that was developed in the war by sheer necessity and pressure of number of casualties created the kind of response system that we continue to use. On the other side of the matter, where veterans survived and received pensions, every pension scheme in the United States owes its origin to the Civil War pensions for soldiers. Since there was an immediate pressing necessity to have a pension system for this huge amount of soldiers that were being pressed into service and also getting killed and wounded, they had to invent something. And over the course of the next 35 years into the 20th century, Congress continued to amend and liberalize pensions to make it possible by the end of that period to secure a pension simply by having had military service during the Civil War, not necessarily being wounded or diseased or have some disability. The term disability we have to use here because it's used at the period, but not extensively. Soldiers who we would count as disabled did not self-identify as such. And it's also worth remembering that however much we want to get close to the experience of the Civil War veteran, we can't retro apply terms like PTSD to the conditions because there was no concept of that at the time, which is why I have an extended discussion of masculinity and femininity in my book, because soldiers who were trying to grope their way to a future with whatever maladies they carried from the war was viewed as feminizing behavior. But to the veterans themselves, what I find is they didn't pretty much care whether they were characterized as masculine or feminine because it's whatever worked. And but that we can explore it in a separate question. I decided to dive into this because during the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, which was 2011 through 2015, lots of museums were doing something about the American Civil War, television programming, and so forth. At the museum where I was director, the Mütter Museum in Philadelphia, we did something unusual. We had an exhibit that lasted 6 years called Broken Bodies, Suffering Spirits, and we focused on the body. We didn't want to talk big generalized stories about how nursing came to be or how hospitals were founded and how medical doctors were trained, but focus on some individual experiences as evocative of the whole. One Black soldier, one white soldier, one white female nurse. I characterize that as female nurse because to a soldier of the Civil War, if you said the word nurse, the first image that comes to mind is a soldier helping out in a hospital who's not able to go out and fight. But by the end of the war, it comes to mean that's a woman, and that's a very significant cultural change. But the trigger point for me was not just taking on this big event. And I grew up with some knowledge of it, not particularly intricate knowledge of strategy and tactics. Knew the names of a variety of generals, as anybody growing up in this country would learn. But it turns out the Historical Medical Library, where I worked, had a very unusual archive. And it turned out to be a portfolio of questionnaires that were filled out by veterans and returned to a Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, who's a chapter of my book. Mitchell had the unusual idea to wait 30 years, 35 years after the war. His son grew up to be a physician and partnered with him to connect with the government to find veterans still surviving who had undergone some pretty nasty experiences during the war. Either they had amputations or had some other serious malady to contend with that might have severely shaped their life circumstances. And this survey was completed and returned by a number of veterans. Some elected simply to write letters and explain the state of their bodies. But it struck me that this is an unusual archive. Nobody else had the idea to survey veterans years later about how their bodies were doing.
Right.
What do you feel? Do you feel pain? What do you eat? What are your sleeping habits? Some fairly intimate information. Now, some of the respondents took the opportunity to write little essays about their experience. Some of them wanted to compliment the doctors that served them during the Civil War. Others gave rudimentary responses. Some wrote letters, and it was a letter in that file that absolutely stupefied me. One of the chapters of my book is about a young man, well, it turned out to be an older man when he died, by the name of Henry Heidekoper, a man of Dutch descent, upwardly mobile family, owned a big business. Here's a man who graduates from Harvard right at the outset of the war. And he is mesmerized by President Lincoln's speeches as published in the newspapers and think this is the man who knows the future. And when the war breaks out, like other young men, he antes up. He's appointed to be a second in command of a regiment. Now, this is a 24-year-old right out of college. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how many young men out of college would like to enter the military and find themselves facing a battle in a matter of months. The
Mm.
pivotal battle in this case for our history was the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in
Mm-hmm.
1863. And that's where Hicks was. And on the first day of a 3-day battle, leading troops where the onslaught of the enemy, the Confederate troops, was so huge and so immediate that all the officers were killed or wounded in his regiment. He himself was shot twice. The second time was in the elbow of his right arm and effectively taking him out of the fight. He walks a mile under fire into the town of Gettysburg to a makeshift church, hospital and a church, with an operating table out in front. And he's told essentially take a number and wait your turn. And he waits
Yes.
inside while other wounded men are serviced. He goes on the operating table and he realizes his arm is probably a loss. His elbow is completely shot away. He's put on a rudimentary tourniquet, and he's anesthetized and still able to talk but not feel pain. And as he's telling the doctor, I think you better give me a good dose of chloroform here because I know you're going to take off my arm. The doctor responded with, "It's already off, Lieutenant Colonel, and get up and go take a seat," which he did. No stretcher bearers to take him away. He has to get
No.
up and go find a place to sit. Um, Not surprisingly, even though he is restored to military service for after a time of healing, it's too much for him, and he ends up leaving the military. But in 1906, now we're talking the 20th century now, not the 1860s,
Mm-hmm.
he writes a letter to this Dr. Mitchell, referring to a conversation that they had. Both of them are living in Philadelphia. Hicks has a prominent public job. Dr. Mitchell is a very prominent physician. And he says, I want to tell you, because I know you're doing research and have gathered questionnaires, what happened to me? And he briefly recounts his behavior at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was shot in the arm. It's a very clinical description. But he gets to the real subject of the letter. He says, the part I want to tell you about, you can use for your research, but do not use my name. And it's this. Today, I am almost 70. It's the 20th century. I am perfectly adjusted to a life with one arm. But when I was first out of the service, I had trouble with that. I'd be in my carriage and a gust of wind would blow off my straw hat and I'd reach up with my non-existent right arm to catch it. He says, but I learned to cope with that and eventually had no problem. Today, I am perfectly adjusted to life with one arm. But the secret here is what happens when I dream. When I dream, I'm always a man with two arms and two hands, always. And in my dreams, I like to pick up and open and read a newspaper. I also like, and I've always liked, the mechanical action of writing. And in my dreams, I pick up a pencil or a pen and I write with my non-existent right arm. And every time I do those activities in my dreams, it induces such a pain in my non-existent arm that it
Wow.
wakes me up in the middle of the night, even after restful sleep.
Mm.
And this has been going on ever since that time. So here's a man in the 20th century telling a doctor an intimate experience that he may never have shared with his family to a physician that he trusts. I was struck by the immediacy of this, the fact that this pain has no past, future. It's just there. It's always
Yes.
there. And he has gone on. He's married. He has a successful life by all outward appearances. And he goes around in public with one sleeve pinned up, which a lot of men
Mm.
did. And it was not a social stigma to see that kind of thing. So here he is confessing this. I was struck by the fact that he still had this problem. It surfaced in dreams. It also evokes something of great interest to Mitchell, the whole idea of a phantom limb, which everybody knows about now.
Yes.
But
Uh-huh.
it's
Uh-huh.
Mitchell who discovered that phenomenon and gave it that name with
Ah.
patients like this man. So that letter just galvanized my attention. And I thought, I've got to know more about this. And it
Yes.
led to another book, which came out a few years ago, that was a study of a surgeon's diary. of a surgeon who, by absolute happenstance, happened to serve with the same guy that I was just talking about. Of all the millions of people who served, these two men served together. Incredible coincidence. So I,
Is it?
or is it?
Is there
Or is
such a
it?
thing, a coincidence? Yeah.
No, it's true. And considering the kind of coincidences that happened in the Civil War, where a brother on one side meets on the battlefield with his brother who enlisted on the other side, you get coincidences like that all the time.
Hmm.
So that letter drove me to examine these surveys in detail and help fashion this exhibit. But I wasn't done with the exhibit, and I began working on what became the book we're talking about today. It
Hmm.
started really about 10 years ago, but it took COVID to give me the time to write it.
COVID ended up being, obviously for many people, pain and suffering, but for others, a wonderful redirect, of getting things done that should have been done. Which, it gave us the gift of time, which
Yes.
very often we don't have. So a lot of good things have come out of that. But there's a few things I want to hit on there, and you're going to see a tail in a moment because I've got a cat now sitting on my lap. Um, the the
I
the
see the tail,
phantom, yeah, yeah, there's the tail.
the phantom
Uh, the,
tail.
the phantom tail, it is attached to a cat.
Yeah.
Um, the phantom thing is, I've heard this before of people without limbs going, I still feel my limbs,
Mhm.
right? And the sad thing is, that struck me on there is that, okay, I dream and I've got both of my limbs, which was kind of the longing or the wishful thinking, even though the rational knows you haven't got it, the desire is still there, but the still feeling of pain.
Yes.
Right. And that,
Yes.
the limb isn't there. It's long gone. There's no actual really physical pain, but it's that emotional pain that manifests in a
Yeah.
physical pain.
Yeah.
And just the one thing we don't even look at today, really, in when it comes to medicine is the not just the psychological, but um the essence pain of what we carry around with. There's so many layers to the human psyche
Right.
and to the human body. And was medical is so much about treating the body, or if
Yeah.
it's post-traumatic stress or some trauma, treating the mind. But what about the other parts of us?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's we don't treat as the whole. And if we look at the whole, I think then we can actually truly understand and start to heal. Out of every war or every um, tragedy or crisis has come innovation. And that
Mhm.
innovation has
Yeah.
seeded,
Yeah.
something for the future. You know, was it the Second World War for the TV? The
Mhm.
internet? All of these things came about. And it's unfortunate that happens to be a war that it brings these things about,
Yeah.
which is sad that we are still, at that stage that we can't have these innovations without. But it is fascinating to know that, kind of the trauma basis, it started then. When you think of how many people were injured at that time,
Mhm.
was there much anesthetic around? Not really. So many people died of infections afterwards because
Yes.
antibiotics weren't even around at that time. So there's so much there physically, emotionally, mentally, that, excuse me, that's going nuts. That we look at that, doing this 35 years later and doing the reveal. If you ask people the questions in the now, they're in the pain, they're in the transition, they're in the suffering, they're in the trauma. But
Mhm.
taking it years later, where they've learned to live with it, adapt with
Mhm.
it,
Mhm.
but to still have that memory and they still have that pain attached, even though it's irrational.
Mhm.
It just really says so much. And I think I had a grandfather that I never met, and my mother was told at the age of 12 that he was dead. And what had really happened is he had gone into a mental institution. He
Mhm.
was a colonel in the British Army in India, and I think it was post-traumatic stress,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And those days, you were just dysfunctional and off you went, and there was shame to it. So doing something like this research, and as you pointed out somewhere in the land there, that there wasn't the shame of walking around without a limb.
Mhm.
There was kind of a respect. And today we look at our soldiers that are coming back, which in so many ways might even be worse because one of the gentlemen I interviewed, his Hummy blew up. Everybody was killed but him. He was completely burnt right down to his skull, right
Mhm.
down to the skin, lost an arm. And it's kind of even more
Mhm.
prevalent, I think, because of the weaponry today. And yet there's still a stigma. Oh, yes, thank you for your service, but I can't look at you. And we've got, have we come so far? Or are we still scratching the surface?
Well, you make a number of excellent points here, and I want to come back to the pain issue particularly, but it's interesting what is lost, what's regained in medical practice. One of the lessons I learned at the Mütter Museum is that most physicians are not trained at all in any historical way. I mean, they don't receive classes on medical history unless there's some professor there who's just big on medical history and wants to make sure
Right.
you learn some. But most physicians I meet pass off the Civil War as a primeval era. And it's interesting that in a time where there is no DNA analysis and no scientific understanding of the genetics of our lives, our bodies,
Hmm.
in that absence, physicians still treated patients holistically. To
Right.
evaluate the patient, they wanted to know your parentage, what kind of
Mm.
jobs you've had, what you are doing now, where you live. All these were considerations, as well as your diet. And during the Civil War, when you had far too many casualties to deal with in an
Yes.
effective way, the North, particularly, which is the best documented, the Northern experience, and of course the winning side, is that by the end of the Civil War, the United States military had the most sophisticated medical system in the world. When the war began, and everybody was frantically looking for medical doctors to put in uniform, and there just weren't enough. So medical students were said, "Hey, get in uniform. We need you."
Yeah.
The big
Learn
example,
on the job, so to speak.
and very much learn on the job,
Yes.
but in the professional mind of the medical world, the last war that we needed to pay attention to for clues was the Crimean War, which of
Hmm.
course America is not involved with that. But one household name is or was, and that's Florence Nightingale. And
Right.
she was extremely influential in the United States in the design of hospitals and the respect for sanitation. And so hospitals were effectively designed in the big cities like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., to her model.
Mm.
And as a result, during the Crimean War, at its worst moment, the British experienced one combat death to approximately 11 to 13 deaths due to disease.
Yes.
In the American Civil War, that was reduced partly because of that experience. One combat death to approximately two deaths due to disease. Still not ideal, but
No.
and all physicians in the military service were aware that we continued to have to work on this. Now it's true, viruses and bacteria were not identified as disease-causing mechanisms for a few years yet,
Hmm.
but they came very, very close and still recognized relationship between cleanliness, clean environments, not reusing bandages, things like this,
Right.
and absence of infection. So hospitals in the remote areas for long-term treatment were pretty well organized. It was a signal characteristic, even if you had tens of thousands of patients, that everyone had an individual diet because the diets were contoured to that overall picture of human health. And then we
Mm.
lose that, of course, when medicine becomes more scientific
Ah,
and
yes.
dependent on lab tests. You know, you don't need to look at the body anymore. So
No.
now that comes back again. So it's a very convoluted history. It's worth pointing out that there are stubborn myths about Civil War medicine that just refuse to die. One is that they didn't use anesthesia, which is not true. And in over 90% of surgeries, north and south, anesthesia was applied either in the form of ether or chloroform. Only in that small percentage where it wasn't, they ran out and
Yes.
they had to do something immediate. But the whole system of triage, borrowed from the French Napoleonic Wars, was employed. So triage, emergency care, ambulances, this whole system evolved very, very quickly and became the template for everything subsequent. Anytime we see a person taken to emergency medical care, we are seeing Civil War medicine. That's where that started. Your primary care provider before the war was a woman in your family, a mother, a sister,
Yes.
cousin, and you were treated at home. Hospitals were places where people died. But the Civil War transformed that utterly, and not just in a medical technological sense, but very sociological, because women now are in hospitals. For
Yeah.
the first time, women are handling bodies in intimate ways of men who are not their relations and
Hmm.
doing it as a professional thing. That was not heard of or thought of
Right.
before the war. And of course, Florence Nightingale comes into that picture as well. So you've I want to come back to the pain point that you were mentioning because that's very much Dr. Mitchell's concern. His identification of the phantom limb phenomenon was a pain phenomenon. Other
Hmm.
doctors criticized him for this because
Hmm.
they said, "No, wait a minute. There's no logic to experiencing pain with something that's not there. It just can't happen." But
Well, no,
Mitchell,
no, it's not a logic thing, though.
it's not, it
Right?
doesn't,
Yes.
and it confounded the very soldiers who were
Yeah.
experiencing this, and eventually they wouldn't want to talk about it. The If I learned anything from working on this book, it was to really thoroughly invest in the psychology of pain, the
Hmm.
complexity of pain,
Hmm.
looking over Mitchell's shoulders, because he alone was really trying to work this out. And he arranged for a special hospital in Philadelphia just to see patients where he could examine their nerves. The nervous system was imperfectly mapped at the time, so he used some pretty unusual treatments. He brought electricity into the hospital. Electricity was not at all a fixture of hospitals in the Civil War, but he did it, and partly to stick acupuncture needles in people,
Yes.
electrify them, and see about and watch the current transfer to other parts of the body using a musical metronome to time how long it took to do this.
Wow.
And thereby not only learn something about how the nerves are working, but in the process hope this is a therapy. Now, on the patient side of this, in Mitchell's ward, when the soldiers saw Mitchell coming down the hallway, they thought, oh no, it's electrocution again, because it could reactivate deadened nerves, but at the same
Mm.
time, it also induced more pain. And that
Yes.
pain could only be mitigated by hypodermic injections of morphine.
Mm.
And some of these soldiers, before they were released from hospital, may have been injected with morphine over 100 times,
And
which
become an
could have
addict.
yes, it could
Yes.
have long-term consequences.
Yes.
But Mitchell is a good example of what happens to medicine when the war ends. Before the war, you could get an MD degree, hang out your shingle after you've been an apprentice for a while to a seasoned doctor, and then do your thing. After the war, we now have specialties. We have
Mm.
emerging cardiology based on stress, combat stress. We have ophthalmology based on eye injuries. We have, in Mitchell's case, neurology. He's the father of American neurology. That
Wow.
owes it to him. He's also one of the founders of American military psychiatry because he made a number of observations during the war which had psychiatric value when military psychiatry really takes off in World War One. So the pain thing is the real vexation here because these soldiers that I write about had pains throughout their lives. And every time they went before a pension doctor who was an examining doctor to
Hmm.
determine if they get a pension, you get an interesting document. The first half of the document, the patient declares, here's what I think's wrong with me. The doctor then does an examination and prepares the second half. Here's what I think is wrong with you,
Right.
whether you get a pension or not and how much. Doctors
Mm.
didn't want to make those determinations, but they were pretty much ordered to do this. Now, if pain is discussed or described, there's nothing the doctor can do with that. It is not a pensionable characteristic in its own right. It's not fixed. The soldier can say, well, I got out of the hospital and I had this big pain in my non existent arm. But now I'm not feeling that so much, but I'm feeling a pain on the other side of the body. Gee, doctor, what's wrong with me? Doctor
Hmm.
says, I can't address that. If you got a visible wound, I can say, here's what it is. Yes, you're suffering from it. You must have pain as a result. I can sign off on your pension. Otherwise, I don't have a vocabulary to even discuss this. Mitchell was the only one trying to do that, create a
Right.
vocabulary and create that communication. And his case notes um, are stylistically interesting because he values very highly, as he says, the intelligent American able to talk about what's happening to his body.
Yeah.
And he had trouble and dismissed those immigrant soldiers who were not fluent in English. He just,
Mm.
if I can't communicate with them, that's half my job, so I
Yes.
can't do anything for them.
It's so interesting because everything stems back. I mean, everything we have today, I've got a book, we've done one book, Our Forgotten Children anthology, and the next book is Our Forgotten Seniors. And, part of it is to celebrate seniors and all their contribution, because everything that the young people have today came from seniors at
Right.
some point.
Yeah.
And everything that, we had, or that we had the ability to create, came from somewhere else. And I mean, I think this is the one thing that's so desperately needed to be addressed in schools and upbringing is like your
Mm.
history doesn't stop at your parents, right?
Right.
It goes so back far in the ancestry. Um, and it today was so focused on the moment in the wrong way, and not being present with self, but being present with TikTok and this and that,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
likes, everything else. That when you talk about history, it is what I did yesterday, not what
Mhm.
historically has carved where you are today. I think one of the reasons I'm very anti-war. I celebrate the soldier that's come back and that has taken charge of their life, and it is an inspiration to other people. Um, but I feel that it's too easy for us to always go to war, and that we need to start learning our language and learning how to speak to one another. And I think the greatest leader are those that can avoid war and not
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
eagerly sent to war. And yet here we are. You're about to have a revolution again in America, which,
Mhm.
hopefully, I do believe it will get violent, but hopefully it will be
Yeah.
curtailed before it gets
Yeah.
too bad. Um, but we seem to be creatures of conflict. And I think one of the things that we do not pay attention to is the psyche, the
Mhm.
sensory psyche of a person and the wounds that they carry around with them that very often they don't even know are ancestral
Yeah.
or old patterning. And
Yeah.
if we still see today, when you go to the doctors, I don't know why I feel like this. Oh, you must be depressed, put you on antidepressants. So
Yeah.
or I can't see anything wrong with you. So therefore there can't be anything wrong with you. But there's got to be something wrong with me because this, and this is happening or not happening or whatever the case is.
Right.
And well, I can't see it, so therefore it isn't. And
Mhm.
I'm too busy, to support pharma. And I've interviewed doctors who have been blacklisted for holistically treating their patients. You're not
Yeah.
pushing procedures, you're not pushing drugs.
Right.
So you're talking about what was learned from the Civil War,
Mhm.
and First World War, Second World War, things that came out of it. But why are we still so far behind in
Yeah.
treating the human
Mhm.
psyche, essence, spirit, your body, soul,
Yeah.
heart of a human being?
Yeah.
And we're still compartmentalizing. If I don't understand it, therefore it isn't.
Right. That is, of course, exactly a consequence of this ultra specialization. And over the years, at the Mütter Museum, which I'm constantly in a medical environment because of that, talking to medical students, many of them profess the viewpoint you've just expressed, that this is what I want to do. This is the way I'm coming to see things. Whether once they're in institutions, that behavior, that outlook persists is another matter. I also talk to doctors towards the end of their career that say, things would be better if we did this
Yes.
wider thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know, the institutional zeitgeist just seems to militate against this idea so much.
It,
And
it's
yes,
it's the
there's money,
accountants and it's pharma, right? It's
it's
all going
pharma,
to,
yes,
it's money. Everything's
it's
down to the dollar sign.
it's true. There are those pressures. It's interesting to follow people like Mitchell, physicians who survived into a different era of medicine. By the time Mitchell has died, there has been as they say, a sea change in the medical world of the United States. During the Civil War, there was no licensing for physicians. To
Mm.
get a medical degree, you would attend a course of study, and it could be at a fly-by-night place or a big university. And it would deal with all the important topics. And at the end of that year, you come back and repeat year one. So you have 2 years, basically 1 year repeated. You write a medical thesis and you get your MD. Um, you don't practice until you've spent some time as an apprentice with an established physician. But some of the big names that surface in the United States as the real medical innovators and leaders, they're able to make changes, but it's always still within institutional
Yeah.
confines. It's not possible for them to really step out and beyond this even when they begin to see the wider picture and see the necessity to evaluate people differently. The other problem, of course, is getting any clinical practice at all. You could go
Mm,
through a course of lectures without any hands-on experience except on a corpse. And for doctors of the Civil War era, chances are the only time they opened up a body was for an autopsy.
yeah.
Now, granted, you had the infection issue that was the reason that when soldiers received, as they say today, gut shots, where some operation to repair of an internal organ would be necessary, there was nothing they could do. Sometimes they attempted, but they knew the chance of infection was near 100% and
Yeah.
had to live with that. Hence, triage, telling a
Mm.
soldier, nothing we can do for you. Do you want some water? We're going to put you outside, and we have other patients. But it's
You're disposable. I mean, how does that feel? Where was the care
yeah.
as somebody is leaving this earth because you can't help them? Instead, it's like, well, you're out with the garbage, right? And
This
it's
is
yeah,
where the poet Walt Whitman comes into play, and I quote him several times. He's sometimes described as a nurse during the Civil War. He was not a nurse, but here's a man who was shocked at the scale of disaster and battlefield murder that was taking place. But he had a brother in service, and he got a word that his brother was wounded, and he went down to Virginia to find his brother, to find his brother's okay. In fact, his brother turned out to have one of those talents for combat that got him promoted up the ranks, and he survived the war and was a good leader. But Walt decided that there was a universe in the hospital that he needed to immerse himself in. And he describes it as a very interesting place to be. He made approximately 600 hospital visits. He described himself as a hospital visitor in Washington, D.C. He carried around a bag of stuff that people would donate to him so he could sit down with soldiers, talk to them, learn where they come from. They have no friends, they don't know anybody, they're
right.
scared. And in some cases, he was the witness to their dying. Other
Mm,
cases, he would become friends even after the war. He would write letters on their behalf to their parents. And he kept a lot of notes about this. This traumatized him
yes, I
and
can imagine.
may have contributed to a heart attack that he had some time a little after the war. But he wrote about the hospital as a place of discovery,
Mm,
and he thought this was this whole expansive human experience encapsulated in a hospital environment. And he's observing not just the soldier patients, but also those who are nurses, particularly women, and also the doctors. He became so familiar. People said, "Oh, Walt, hello. Come on in." Hospitals were public places in those days. People would come in and gawk or come in and talk to patients. But he had this view, and it became clear that hospitals, even for some of the men I wrote about, were not necessarily bad places to be. There was immense opportunity for self-discovery
mm.
and a change of vision about how they want to conduct their lives when they emerged. And Walt was very, very explicit and right on in describing that, not only in his prose, but in his poetry.
Mm. And that again, out of necessity,
Yeah.
and it's somebody seeing, isn't anybody paying attention?
Mhm.
Isn't anybody speaking to these people? And the nurses and the doctors are trying to save lives. So
Mhm.
for them, they didn't have the time. They're probably so burnt out themselves as well. So this
Yeah.
is where you do need, those people that come in just simply to calm a patient, or if they are on their way out, what would you like your family to know? It's dignity,
Yes.
dignity and respect. And I've interviewed a number of people that are deaf doulas called deaf
Oh, right.
midwives.
Yes.
And we celebrate a birth of a child coming in. Why can't we celebrate a life leaving?
Yeah.
And we don't. We just love they're dead, move on. And we don't honor the life of the contribution or even give them a graceful exit.
Mhm.
And so there's so much wrong with society now where I feel that as human beings we've gone so far down the wrong way. We
Mhm.
should be learning so much from from this kind of history.
Mhm.
Whereas where did medicine, whoa, that came about then, that came
Mhm.
about this, or this was needed then. You know what? We don't have it now. Let's bring it back. Or
Mhm.
let's look at what's missing and how we can bring it back because hospitals have
Mhm.
become so clinical.
Mhm.
And even to see, I've just recently managed to get a doctor and I didn't have one for 7 years because we have a shortage of doctors is here in Canada. And
Mhm.
when you do see them, it's generally one question, 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's so how, I'm going in with a pain, but that pain is a symptom of what the problem is. And how can you, in 3 minutes, assess what that problem is?
Right.
It's come all the way down to the accountants and how
Mhm.
they're going to make as much money as possible. And I think this is across the board where we're looking at
Mhm.
society of we've put money as the god,
Mhm.
as the ruler. Hence, what's going on with your politics right now? All these
Yes.
billionaires buying their way in, where they're
Right.
quite honestly, um,
No,
misogynistic, narcissistic, entitled people with no
exactly.
clue whatsoever.
Exactly. Yes, that's
So,
right.
we need to bring that humanity back where we need to actually look at caring for the whole body. And, you look at alternative medicine. Is it alternative? It was there forever.
That's right.
Western medicine became the alternative, and then it became the be all and dismissing of the other. No, both has its places.
Mhm.
Trauma medicine, of fixing a leg or heart transplant, of all the other things that we can do today, absolutely brilliant. But it's not about maintaining health or
Mhm.
preventing, right?
Mhm.
It's about fixing the trauma in the moment. Whereas you look at other medicine and other modems of healing, it
Mhm.
is about sustaining wellness within the being.
Mhm. That's interesting to reflect on the Civil War context. The government, in appointing doctors into military service, where they were called surgeons in the army, they were just called surgeon. They were taken from a very specific ideology of medicine because the people in charge of the medical establishment in the military were also of that same disposition. We
Hmm.
call them allopaths today. And we go to hospitals, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get allopathic treatment. But the big competing ideology was homeopathy at the beginning of
Hmm.
the Civil War. One of the doctors that I've got in my first book that came out a few years ago was a doctor who was adept in both domains. He
Hmm.
had homeopathic medicines and subscribed to some homeopathic principles. At the same time, he qualified as an allopath for military purposes. But it's fascinating because there are points of convergence even then, which were recognized. There were other strains of medical thought and philosophies that were common at the time that had a big stress on botanical medicines, for example,
Hmm.
and distrust of some of the incipient pharmaceutical products
Right.
that were kind of because the war had to ramp up the production of medicines and big medicine laboratories and so on. But the uh, reason the American Medical Association was created in the 1840s was to keep out the other guys, to keep the homeopaths from
Yes.
getting in. That's why licensing started in the U.S. It was so you could license the one kind
Mm.
and not the other, so you
Instead
could
of
limit it.
cohesively working together, because each one has its place, it
And
became competitive.
yes,
Right.
and the man I'm thinking of, who was working both sides of the aisle, some of the therapies actually converged. And my favorite example of that is vaccination. Until
Hmm.
COVID vaccine, which is a beautiful story in its own right, how we got there, vaccines have always been the actual substance of the disease in a diminished form, put in a healthy body so you could build up antibodies against it. That's how we did
Hmm.
smallpox. And smallpox was the one disease you could vaccinate against in the Civil War. But in the homeopathic manuals, vaccination is a homeopathic practice. In the allopathic world, it's also a sanctioned medical practice. The
Hmm.
exact same thing, but for different reasons. And the result is you get a person immune, at least for a while.
Yeah. And again, that's a huge controversy
Yeah.
right now too, right? Isn't it? And it's like, why
Yeah.
do we not learn? And that's what I'd like to know is that, when we're put in a state of crisis, we learn skills and tools and abilities that, as you said, from the Civil War that is used today, the trauma, the everything else. We've learned what works, but why are we still so slow? What is it about a mentality of putting everything in a nice little compartment box and
Mhm.
not allowing them all to be in the same room, so to speak?
Mhm.
Everything has its place. And if we allow everything to have its place,
Mhm.
we're then dealing with people on the whole, holistically,
Mhm.
paying attention to every part. Anybody that's gone through cancer, anybody that's gone through a physical trauma, anybody that's gone through mental trauma, there is going to be trauma that's happening somewhere in the body. If it's physical, it's going to be mental trauma. If it's mental trauma, it's going to be affected physically.
Yeah.
And we can't keep compartmentalizing the human body and psyche and only treating this and that and this and that. We've got to be holistic, which means both aisles have to come together,
Yeah.
which we see in human mentality. We love to segregate, us against them instead of let's collaborate.
Right. Right. Yeah, saw an example of this just recently. My wife seemed to be having stroke symptoms, so we thought. Called our primary physician, who said, "Get to an emergency room."
Yeah,
Went to the emergency room, and to the credit of the emergency room, they dealt with this straight away. From the minute you walked in the door, it was 10 seconds before you found yourself in a hospital bed with everybody testing everything. And after a few days in the hospital, keeping an eye on her, there was no evidence of a stroke. All the tests said no stroke. And the one physician who said, "I know what this is," was said it's a psychogenic issue with a past trauma that surfaced with these manifestations.
yes.
And
Hmm.
and I could only imagine the room of doctors discussing the case, where the ones who are just not at all attuned to psychogenic
Right.
issues said,
Yes.
"Absolutely not." So the guy who actually wrote the release report was not that guy. And the other one said, "Well, we think a minor stroke took place here." And
Right.
my wife, who's former professor, she's literate, and she writes a long letter saying, "I had a great experience in the hospital, but this was not the diagnosis. This was
Yeah.
not the problem. No tests confirm this." And the doctor's
Yes.
saying this. The other guy who gave a good, valid reason, he's not on the map. What happened to him? And
Yeah.
he worked in the same hospital. So
Right.
one side of that hospital is not trusting the other
I
side of
know
the
it doesn't make
hospital.
sense. And this is what I don't understand about humanity.
Yeah.
I really don't. When are we going to learn? I draw the analogy that each and every one of us is in discovery of what our instrument is. And we learn how to play that instrument. We can play it well as a soloist. However, if we learn to join an orchestra that we're in sync with, and each one in our own strength play together harmoniously together, we transcend any ability that we can do on our own. And it's been proven over and over and over and over again throughout history. The coming together makes the difference. Yet, as humanity, we still want to segregate and pitch against each other. I don't get it.
I don't either.
I don't know. Is there hope for us? Um, I love it when we do learn from history, if we learn from history, because really what we're looking at, there's so many things we keep repeating, but that's happened before. Why didn't you learn last time?
Yeah.
And we also seem to be quite denialists when it comes to no, that didn't happen. Yes, it did. History pointed it out. No, we'll erase that history, right? Instead of referring to it and learning from it. And it's you take what really works and you perfect it even more, but you become inclusive
Yeah.
with the other instrument that really works. Find the music where you can play together.
Mhm.
I never knew that all of this came from the Civil War. I know a
Mhm.
lot came from the Second World War, even the First World
Mhm.
War. In
Mhm.
the First World War, my grandmother was the one that drove to the front with the ambulance, right at the
Uh-huh.
front line to pick up
Uh-huh.
the people.
Right.
She in her handbag didn't have a lipstick, she had a toolkit.
Sure.
She
Sure.
was one of those. Died young at 66 with heart disease, which I think everything caught up. My dad was a fighter pilot, squadron leader in the war, died at 45.
Mm.
And the stress of it caught up. And
Mhm.
we don't look at how much damage stress does to the mind, to the body, the psyche. And again, it's just antidepressant pills, a label.
Mhm. Mhm.
But then where is the research? Why are we not looking at the whole there?
Mhm.
The evidence is there in the past. Why are we not paying
Yeah.
attention to it?
Because the past doesn't get examined as much as
Yeah.
it should for things like this. And
Yes.
where the American Civil War is concerned, there are lots of books on the Civil War that come out every year, very few about veterans. I wanted to do something unusual with veterans and give a wound's eye view of their lives
Mm,
subsequent to the war. And but mainstream historians, the ones who get quoted on the in the TV serials and the documentaries, uh, practically universally condemn Civil War medicine for what it did not do. And they're
Mm.
using old tropes and bad examples like anesthesia, like they didn't use anesthesia or used it sparingly, which is just not true. And but they don't read the medical literature. They're not reading the medical reports. What do these doctors actually say to themselves or to their colleagues? Um, I get shivers down my spine sometimes reading this material, even from the Confederacy, which was just an absolute disaster after the war, and picking up the pieces. One doctor named Jones had a very interesting assignment under the Confederacy, and he filed his report to headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, which was promptly burned by the Confederates when they gave up the town, burning all the medical records.
Oh no.
And his report was to look at a phenomenon happening when soldiers were being vaccinated for smallpox,
Mm.
a disease. He called it spurious vaccination, where something seemed to be introduced with the vaccination, in this case, syphilis.
Oh.
So soldiers would see how vaccination was done. Just prick the skin a little bit, put a little substance
Mm.
in there, and they figure, well, I can do that. Go home on leave. Hey, there's a guy with smallpox down the street. I'll go puncture one of his little pustules and anoint myself and then bring some back for my buddies. Little did they know the guy had the smallpox, also had syphilis. So
Oh
it's
no.
spread. So they had this epidemic of syphilis within the army. He wrote this very detailed report about this, and mindful of not quite the scientific language that we would expect in a paper today. That report is burned. The year after the war, he writes to every former Confederate doctor he can find and says, please, I want to reconstruct this report. Tell me anything you remember about these cases. So he gets all these letters and he puts them together and issues this new publication 2 years after the war. It's fascinating because you see this eagerness to try to figure out what is happening here, and which gets them into the realm of other aspects of social behavior because of the syphilis and the consorting
Mm-hmm.
with prostitutes and so on, which they didn't expect to get into. So they get into that realm. But also, it kind of kicks up the scientific interest because the Confederacy, at the last year of the war, decided we got to contain this problem. So every time they started vaccinating in the major hospitals, they'd give the soldier a ticket, a vaccination record, said, carry this around. It identifies when you were vaccinated and where. So if somebody wants to check on why you're getting some mysterious disease, we might be able to contact trace. That was a new thing. Nobody did it, but they innovated it under essentially no resources. But it's interesting, Dr. Jones, I said some of this text can be really chilling. He talks about how the Confederacy went about trying to produce vaccine when they couldn't get any. Uh, they went around to plantations which were isolated with Black children and white children and purposely inoculated those with smallpox or from the alternate smallpox light, as I call it, vaccine disease, which is cowpox also.
Right.
And then come back 2 weeks later when the kids are all manifesting the symptoms and drain all their pustules or take their scabs and use them for medicine and recycle them and keep
I
doing it.
remember.
So they
Yes,
were
I remember.
harvesting kids, they were harvesting
Yes.
children.
Mm.
And here's this doctor compiling this report later saying, this is tough going. But he said, I am convinced vaccination is the way forward. It is the definite thing if done properly, without this impurity stuff and syphilis getting in. We have the means to eliminate this disease from the world. Someday it's going to happen. We follow this. We purify our methods, be more strenuous with our safeguards. We are going to get there. And damn it, 1979, it happened.
Yeah.
But it was just amazing to read that. And it's as if I'm sitting next to him as he's thinking these thoughts aloud. That's what it's like reading this stuff that
Yes. Well, you know, the
constitutes the
innovation,
material
right?
for
I
the
mean,
book.
everything we have, everything that we do comes from somebody else's innovation,
Yeah.
somebody's, you know, point of view of surely we can do this. And we see smallpox is no longer around, polio is no longer around. Um, of course, we've got
Oh, polio's still around
where it's not as it's
in
happened, so
Asia.
it's coming back
And
in a big way.
well, polio still exists, and it's happening in countries where Islamic extremists
Mm,
are killing
and
doctors and aid workers who want to administer
vaccinate,
vaccinations for these diseases.
right? Yes. So we know that vaccines work. But the one thing I am against is, especially because I have two grandbabies, and every time they've had their vaccinations, there's too many things in one time in the
Right.
vaccination, and I feel
Yeah.
it's just too much to overload a
Mm,
child with. And every time they've had that vaccination, they've really been severely miserable or,
mm,
developed something.
mm,
And so I think that we've got to stop loading everything up and assuming the body can take it.
mm,
Because I
mm,
think, less is more. All right,
mm,
rather than come
mm,
back later and have the next lot rather than everything all at once. But I think
mm.
it ended up being a money efficiency thing rather than, a logical,
Yeah.
practical thing. So everything goes back to money. But
Mm,
it's amazing of that when we're willing to discover, willing to pay attention. Oh, what have we got here?
mhm,
Instead of dismissing it because we don't
mm,
understand it,
mhm,
where these innovations comes is from people going, this is intriguing. What is
mhm,
there to learn from this?
mhm,
Right? What if we did this? What if we did that? And that's where we get these kind of results and things that we have today because
mhm,
somebody was intrigued of what
mhm,
could happen.
mhm.
And that we've got a lot to be grateful for because they are the seeders of these possibilities
Yeah.
today. And if we don't know about this, it's one thing I do like about what Facebook does. They'll bring up somebody from the past. This was the
Mhm,
founder of this. This was the
mhm,
creator of this.
mhm,
And especially if there were people of color or a woman,
mhm, mhm.
they were never ever given any credit for anything, right?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Yeah.
100 years later, they're now getting the credit
Mhm,
and the awareness. And a lot of it is we're just unaware. I'm of the motto that when we are aware, we begin to care. And
mm,
if we care, then we're
mhm,
going to do something about it, even
mhm,
if it's just speaking about it
mhm,
and opening up that dialogue. Did you know?
mhm,
And this is so intriguing. And well, from that, did you know this happened?
mhm,
And I think when we're more engaged with why things have happened, where they've come from, what possibilities and doors they've opened, we
mhm.
become more immersed in that. And I think can see things even in our own lives from a different perspective. But
Sure.
history is not the sexy thing in school. It's something boring
No.
for kids instead of making it something intriguing that matters to them today.
Yeah, the key, I think, and yes, I was talking to a history teacher a few nights ago about this kind of thing, who's using some Civil War primary material that where his kids can engage directly with the voice of a specific person. Certainly, to remove the generalities and talk about
Mhm.
the lives of specific people, not necessarily as role models, but as people who coped with something
Yes.
and tried to find a solution or experience something that people fortunately don't have to experience very often, like an army coming across your lawn to torch your house. Although who knows if that's going
Oh,
to
yeah,
happen in our hemisphere?
unfortunately. Yes,
But
unfortunately.
but also it's and Mitchell would point this out, and his two colleagues who served with him in this ward in Philadelphia doing innovative stuff. One of the colleagues, a man named Keene, said that Mitchell had a yeasty mind because it was always in ferment.
Mm,
And he was always thinking of new
yeah.
possibilities. And he would have been very pleased with the military doctor who hit upon a very unusual thing in recent times. You were talking about like soldiers had blown up in a Humvee, and a
Mm,
man survived it, but horribly burned and so forth. The one comment I've gotten from military surgeons is when they look at the documentation of Civil War wounds, and there's a photographic series that the
mm,
federal government did, taking pictures of soldiers either during or immediately after the war to show the injuries and maybe how they were healed or how they were healing.
mhm,
Um, the physicians tell me that with the improvised weapons that have been used in Afghanistan and Iraq, we're seeing injuries of a type, a variety, and a number of them similar to Civil War injuries,
mm. Makes sense.
that we're seeing these wounds that we haven't seen since the Civil War. Because since the Civil War, the nature of armament fired from rifles, particularly, has been very different. High velocity, jacketed rounds that pierce the body and pierce everything else. And the improvised weapons look like Civil War injuries. And when it comes to Dr. Mitchell and his phantom limb, Uh, no one today still understands why that phantom sensation exists.
Mhm,
No one understands today why the pain can be there and
mhm,
why it can change its character, even the notion of the limb itself. You could have an arm amputated, but then feel the hand attached directly to your
mhm.
shoulder and the arm's not there, or it changes.
Yep.
And yet, I saw a photograph from an army hospital of a man who had his amputated leg. It was taken away because of an improvised weapon in Afghanistan. He's an army sergeant. He's sitting in bed, and he's just in a t-shirt and shorts, and he's sort of grinning at the camera while doctors are standing around, like looking at him like this. And what's unusual is he's got one good leg, and in place of where his other leg would have been, somebody handed him a mirror going the length of his leg. And his mind is registering, I see a leg here, I see a leg there. Pain reduces owing to
Ah,
a trick of vision.
wow.
And
Mm,
nothing plugged in the wall, no medicine
right.
taken. It's a mirror. And it's become used often enough, it's now referred to as mirror therapy. It doesn't work in every instance. And of course, they don't know why it doesn't work when it does
Hmm.
work. So I'm just amazed with that kind of example of that absolutely 19th century technology that's mitigating pain without taking any drugs at all.
Right.
And an amputee who's sitting there smiling because his pain went away.
Yes. But it's also
Mirrors.
kind of, it goes into our cellular memory.
Yeah.
I think there's trillions of cellular memory there that unless we kind of go through the layers of where that memory stems from, we can't release it. We can't look at it and identify what it is and
Mm-hmm.
understand what it is and release it. And I think this is why, especially in trauma, or physical or emotional, we
Mm-hmm.
see it constantly remanifesting all the time because we don't understand. Oh, I thought I'd dealt with that. I thought I'd, come face to face with that and release it. Yes, but further down is more cellular memory
Mm-hmm.
that now is being triggered and you're feeling this all over again. No, it hasn't come back. It's just another layer of memory. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's how much of that is what they're feeling, the
Mm-hmm.
memory of the pain or the memory of the leg being there in that cellular memory, or how much of that is something else. I mean, that's what's so intriguing.
It's interesting where the insights in that area seem to be coming from. It's a minor part of my book, but people who are practitioners or teachers of dance, professional
Mm,
dance, and the subject category is proprioception, I guess. Um, they some interesting writings by some people who are dance professors talking about body memory,
mm-hmm,
talking about how that memory can be shaped and guided and used in professional dance.
mm-hmm.
And when I saw some of that literature, I thought, damn, this is stuff that could be in medical literature, but isn't. And
Right.
unless somebody has that interest in walking across the street to this other domain saying, hey, dance people,
Yes.
talk about this. There's something going on here that works in both of our territories. Let's see what we can explore. There are
I
probably
always
some
believe
doctors
there's
somewhere doing it, but
the thing is, I always believe there is a solution.
yeah,
Wherever there's a problem, there is a solution. But if we're so busy compartmentalizing and segregating things instead
yeah.
of, communitizing and putting things under one umbrella, with somebody saying, this is my strength and this, but I think what you need is so and so right now.
Mhm.
Or,
Mhm.
let's go and take you over to them and see what they can do. And you may have to go through a few modalities before you find the answer or find what it is you need to know. But
Right.
they're under one umbrella supporting each other. That's kind of my
Mhm.
platform here and self-discovery wisdom is putting people under that umbrella that
Mhm.
you can find that it isn't one size that fits all. There isn't just
Mhm.
one answer to everything,
Mhm.
that we have to be willing to explore
Mhm.
and open mind to something we don't understand and be willing to try something to see if it works for us. But if
Right.
we don't have that exploratory mind, then we in our limited mind, we compartmentalize in a nice little box and it's not working for us. And then, we're suffering.
There is your avenue for teaching history to find examples of people who think that way, who've acted on it successfully.
Hmm.
And that excites younger people to learn
Yes.
about these kinds of possibilities. And it's something they think, gee, I could possibly do that if I
Yeah.
thought that way. That's where you do that. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, this is why the importance of this next book of mine, I've forgotten seniors, with each person would contribute a chapter because, A, I don't think seniors are treated very well in North American. In
Yes,
in
true.
other cultures, they're
Yeah.
revered, they're respected and they're admired for their contribution here. put out to pasture and dismissed.
Yeah.
And so, but like what you're doing, just the taking the history and showing how it's relevant today.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that relevance of today and knowing where it came from in an intriguing mind, what could they do with it tomorrow? But
Mm-hmm.
they're unaware of it. My motto with the shows is listen, learn, and apply.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So, once you've learned something, how do I apply it in my life? Where can I take this? And
Mm-hmm.
I think we've become knowledge. I know this knowledge, full stop. No, it's a comma. What can you do with this knowledge? Where can you take it? Where's the
Right,
wonderment and ex
right.
exploration? Everything comes from something.
Mm-hmm.
Everything has a root,
Mm-hmm.
a core. Let's look at that root and how does it branch off? Where does it go? Where could it go?
Mm-hmm.
How can we adjust it to today's needs and be exploratory and open-minded, but also open-hearted?
Yeah, yeah. This may not be the best example of what you're describing, but it's an example I like to bring up because it startles a lot of people, and that's leeches.
Hmm.
Medical
Hmm.
leeches have
Hmm.
made a big comeback in medicine. 20th century, of course, medicine became white lab coats and sterile
Yes.
rooms and sterile equipment. And the idea of
And
an
sterile
animal,
treatment,
yes,
emotionally in every way.
in
Yes.
every way, but the idea of using an animal as an agent of healing. And yet, like maggots, they're back.
Yes.
And
Yes.
leeches are particularly fun because I kept a few medicinal leeches at Pets at where when I was at the Mütter Museum, and I discovered I started feeding them on myself as a medical experiment to let them feed on me. And these were leeches from hospitals. They were kept
Hmm.
in sterile conditions, so they didn't have like syphilis or other diseases,
Right.
and had never bitten anybody before. And they live about 8 or 9 years. And if you're taking care of them, hospitals destroy them when done. But it turns out, bringing back the leech, they are the single best tool for microsurgery, like the person who loses a finger in an industrial accident and they try to
Hmm.
reattach it. The biggest problem there is are you either going to get gangrene or is blood going to start circulating again? If it
Right.
circulates, that you have a chance. And it could be more than it could be a foot, it could be a whole hand. And what the leech does is, uh, unlike maggots, it's not cleaning the wound, but it ingests blood very, very, very slowly, and it relieves the bruising. It introduces a chemical that's both a blood thinner and a vasostimulator and dilator that helps encourage blood flow and the capillaries to start naturally making connections again. And there was a woman in Sweden who had bent over to pet, I think it was a pit bull, that decided at that moment to grab her on the face. And she instinctively, of course, stood up,
Yeah.
and part of her face went with the dog.
Wow.
And they were able to grab that and put it in ice, get it to the hospital. And so this was a good half of her face that was torn off at the nose.
Ouch.
And they applied 300 leeches around the wound, and it restored circulation to the entire piece that was taken off. The scarring, they managed to uh, get that to be minimally obtrusive as that woman survived. And it was all down to leeches. There's nothing else in medicine. There's no electrical tool that can do what a leech can do.
Wow.
And both in terms of encouraging blood flow and has an anti-clotting mechanism, so it's a good blood thinner. Plus, they're experts at this. And in the 19th century, I thought I'd go back and see some of the leech guidance back then. Um, no surprise. In an era when bloodletting was a common therapy, doctors were opining in print. Well, we got these mechanical devices for bloodletting, but you run the risk of taking out too much. Use a leech. People
Mm.
call them companionable animals. They are gentle. You don't feel the pain. And if you just sit back and relax, they're going to fall off when they're done. They can't take too
Mm.
much out. You can't just exsanguinate, even though there's no clotting. I don't, the clot will return after the leech is detached, but leeches, use them. And manuals even talked about how to reuse a leech by when the leech is all done and fed and happy, you bleed the leech and get the blood out so they're hungry again.
Oh no.
And I found that myself listening strangely to young women talking about maternity issues because it felt very maternal to feed a leech on my arm. And I did it on the same part of my arm so I could type, and keep an eye on what Horatio was doing. And
I used to
um,
have a goldfish called Horatio.
well, they were all H's. Horatio, Harvey, Hunter and Harvey after physicians. Horatio, just because I thought of Horatio Nelson at that moment. But and they kind of made fun pets. But
Mhm.
I was able to distinguish slight personalities between them over
Mm.
time, and I would use them to feed on the same spot on my arm, so I only had one scar to show for it. But it was a real spectator sport because kids love to watch this, and people are very curious. And they say, "Ooh, a leech!" And then when you tell them how important they are, I like to ask kids. I said, "Well, this is a creature that is friendly to you and can help you maintain health. And by the way, how many brains have you got?" Well, a leech has like what, 18 more? Well,
Wow.
so don't underestimate the power of this little guy.
Don't
So I'm happy to
underestimate
stand with
nature,
him.
right? I mean, nature's always
Exactly.
got an answer.
Yes.
Right? I mean, every single living thing, except for mosquitoes,
Yeah.
has a reason
Right.
for being here. Has a position. And mosquitoes, I think, are just here to bug us. But everything has a reason, a job,
Yeah.
right? Including us, which we've seemed to have forgotten
Yeah.
about. Sorry, Teresa, she wanted to go out. We and if we actually learned what our job is, what our instrument is, then we will actually understand that's part of the orchestra, that's part of our
Mhm.
contribution. But
Mhm.
I think it is about time that we holistically look at nature and all the gifts. And I would be fascinated with somebody who's done that documentation going back the centuries
Mhm.
as to what's being used, like turmeric and ginger and garlic and all of these type of things with so many medicinal things.
Yeah.
No, they didn't have the surgery that we are capable of doing today, heart surgery. And my son just smashed every bone in his ankle and foot. And
Mhm.
yes, he needed a surgeon, to put that all back together.
Mhm.
So both medicines have their place. But when we're looking at wellness holistically of a person, we have to think beyond the doctor. They're
Mhm.
there to fix things.
Mhm.
They're not there to maintain, and they're not there for for the after treatment. And
Mhm.
there's always an answer if we're willing to open up our minds and stop being so limited. Well, I don't know about that, so I'm not going to do it. Well, I
Mhm.
don't know about that. What research can I do? What's
Mhm.
been written about it? What experiences have other people had about it? Am
Mhm.
I willing to give it a try to see if it works for me? But I
Mhm.
think that unwillingness to learn
Right.
is what's got us into a position that we're in today as a humanity.
Ah, sigh. Yes.
It's
If only they
time to
could put
put our
us in
thinking
charge.
caps on. Oh, exactly. I've actually got a new genre opening up called the Sisterhood of Common Sense Love, and all
Ah,
the men that love and support them. And it's
yeah.
really, what I'm seeing. I'm in Canada, but we've got our own problems here,
Mhm.
politically as well. But what I'm seeing over there is that you've got a hurricane, tsunami, and an earthquake all happening at once politically,
Mhm.
and there's going to be massive fallout. And for me, it's about that common sense love, that mama approach. Okay, we know that when the tantrum is over,
Mhm.
and all the fallout is there, that there's going to be so many people that are going to need to be picked back up,
Mhm.
healed, and put on the right path. So
Mhm.
we need to be ready.
Mhm.
We need to be ready to deal with this. And that means we need all hands on deck. Whatever your strength, whatever your forte is, let us come together. And so I
Mhm.
know who to call on, for whom, when, and when we
Mhm.
can just get on with putting things right and putting things in a new direction. It's that no nonsense approach, that common sense thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we desperately need. Um,
Yes.
you know, so, that is again, I think I think a lot to do with our generation. We know what my daughter said when she had her baby. How did you do it with three, Mum? And I said, I don't know. I just did it.
Mhm.
Right? You just did it. And you look at all our generations going back with whatever they did, they dealt with whatever they were given.
Mhm.
And they've either found good out of it or they survived it and they picked themselves up and they moved back on.
Mhm.
And really, we have a society of a lot of wimps today
Mhm.
and moaners and groaners instead
Mhm.
of, taking charge and ownership. You're hurting. What are you going to do about it? Find
Yeah.
ways to heal.
Yeah.
Don't stay the victim and have everybody look at you and think, poor you. Every
Hmm.
single one of us has had something to deal with, and we've got to find our way forward. And the way forward is knowing what's happened in the past
Hmm.
that's worked. How can we apply it today to today's needs?
Hmm. Yes. Well said.
That's where we're at. I'm glad you've written. I've learned so much today about this that I didn't know. And it's like, again, unfortunate that we have to learn so much through war.
Yes.
Again, I suppose a lot through disasters as well. We learn a great deal from disasters, and certainly Mama Earth is pissed off with us right now and giving us a lot of disasters that we're needing to
Mhm.
adjust to. But that's where the innovation comes from. And what we need is leaders around the world that go, we're calling on the innovators. What can you learn from the past that works? How can we modify it for today and put it in place? And we need that open mind, open heart, and open sensibility in order
Here,
to get
here.
things done.
Yes.
So this book needs to be read. If you're listening, it's a great book to actually donate to your schools,
Mm.
donate to your communities, because the more that we understand about the past and where things come from, the
Mhm.
more we understand the relevance of them today, but the more it invites innovation of where we can take it tomorrow.
Mhm.
So we have to understand past, present, and future are all one. So
Yes.
quickly tell us about the other book that you wrote.
The other book is called Civil War Medicine, a Surgeon's Diary. In this case, there are approximately 40 known published books based on the diaries or correspondence of doctors.
Mhm.
And I wanted to do something different. I was giving a presentation about the Civil War exhibit in Massachusetts. I was giving this, and a man came up. In fact, it was about that fellow, Henry Cooper, that was at the Battle of Gettysburg, lost his arm, wrote that letter that so much
Mhm.
influenced me. And I was talking about him. And a man in the back of the room raised his hand and said, I know that man because he's in my ancestor's diary. And I said,
Ah,
oh, let's talk. And
yes.
the family had a diary of this surgeon named Fulton, James Fulton, who astonishingly served in the same brigade as Cooper, and they were friendly. And so my guy is mentioned in this diary. So I was very intrigued. And I said, well, this diary I think has value as a publication. Could I have your permission to work with this and create an edition of it? And they said yes. So did a transcription of it anew, annotated it because it names a lot of places and circumstances that would not be immediately obvious what they were, and with introductory material. But I also went to the major names in Civil War medical scholarship, and I posed questions to each one. I said, would you be willing to write an essay for this book addressing some questions based on this diary? And for one thing, the diary doesn't mention anything about female nurses. It
Mm.
does mention women volunteering during the Battle of Gettysburg, townspeople. So I went to a nursing historian who specializes in the Civil War and said, write an essay about what's not in this diary. What is
Yes.
in the environment that is not being recorded here? But I also asked other people to comment in essays about medical training, about the politics and worldview expressed
Mm.
in this diary. And so part two are these essays. So it's an edited volume, really. And I think it stands unique because no one else that I've seen, even the scholars who have taken on some kind of diary, haven't tried to collect views of relevant scholars to comment on specific aspects of a diary. They just annotate it and identify, who's talking to whom here. So that's what it is. It's the diary of this Dr. Fulton. His big moment was the Battle of Gettysburg, where he himself was captured and still had to provide medical help to hospitals that he had was responsible for, and do this under Confederate rule for a few days. And he was very self-conscious at the time that this is going to probably be the big moment of his professional life, the Battle of Gettysburg, and
Mm.
thus it emerges from his diary. So that's what it is, and um, it's a good standalone read. But also, if you want to get more into the heads of Civil War doctors, that's a place to do it. I
Right.
wanted to write it as if I was an anthropologist investigating the culture of military medicine at that time, and I was
Mm.
interviewing one of its members as an anthropologist, and that's the approach I took.
Right. Again, When we're aware, we care. It's just like the intriguing to know this is what happened then. I mean, you can't undo knowledge. Once you know, you know. And instead of dismissing it, allow it to illuminate and want to know more. Because when we understand from whence things came, we understand why we're here, we
Mhm.
are today, and what we can do about it tomorrow. So I think that history has such an enormous place. I mean, I will admit at school it was too dry and boring. Where
Mhm.
I learned about it was reading novels that had the story based around the
Mhm.
history.
Mhm.
And, one
Mhm.
of the big influences of me when I was growing up was A Horseman Riding By,
Mhm.
about a guy coming back from the Boer War, selling
Mhm.
the oil, the ironworks that he had, and becoming a squire. And then over the next, right up into the mid
Mhm.
60s, the change of squireship because of the
Mhm.
wars and
Yeah,
everything
yeah.
going on. And I learned more about the transition of history,
Mhm.
of history that had been around for hundreds of years and how much it changed in those 60 years, um, than I did for the history books, because the history books gave me name and things like that, but it didn't give me intrigue. It didn't give me characteristics of story. And I think when you can put a story, a face, a character, a
Right,
person to it, you
exactly.
become more engaged
Yes.
into it, instead of just, names, dates, this
Oh, yeah,
boring.
yeah.
Give it a
Mhm. Yeah.
story, give it a character, give
That's
it
right.
something, right?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. That is
So
the
there's
way.
two books that you can donate to the school now
Yeah,
and
right.
to the
Right.
community. And also, I'm very much about people having book clubs and talking about which is absolutely have a book club on this. But I'm also about having podcast clubs
Mm.
where you listen to a podcast, each take your own notes and then share them afterwards.
Mm.
Because
Mhm.
again, this is your perspective. That's somebody else's. Suddenly you've got a bigger picture,
Mhm.
right, of sharing it. And it's all about sharing the knowledge, being willing to talk about things,
Mhm.
right? And it just being intrigued. I think
Mhm.
that's something we need to bring back in fashion.
Yeah, you bet. Yes.
Now, how do people and where do they buy the books? Because I'd like them to get both of them, but also how do they reach you?
Well, the way to get the books is Indiana University Press website. If you just go to a computer, Google Indiana University Press, you get their website. And you can check under my name, Robert Hicks, and both books will come up. And they on the listings, they also have the table of contents and sample words of praise from people who've read and commented on the book. But also, where the current book, Wounded for Life, is concerned, if you go to the website, Indiana University Press website, and I think it's just iupress.org, I think, but Indiana University Press, Wounded for Life. If you order this book before, I think, mid-February, you can get a 30% discount by doing this. You order the book, and then during checkout, it will ask you if you have a discount code. The discount code is Union Vets, as one word, Union Vets. You put that in there, it'll drop your price by a third and save you some bucks. That way, you can buy
Exactly.
two books and give them the two libraries. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And of course, if people want to reach out to you to have a further discussion or book you for a talk,
Yes.
whether it could be a Zoom talk or in talk in person, what is your email? How do they reach you?
The email address to reach me is Loxodrome. I'll spell that word Loxo, D as in David, ROM as in Mary E. Loxodrome053 at gmail.com.
So it's iupress.org, Wounded for Life, the books are both there. And then Loxdrome, Loxodrome 053 at gmail.com. This is, if you listen to this as a teacher, or just, somebody that loves to put on talks, whether it's done by Zoom, where are you? What area are you in?
I'm just north of Philadelphia, USA.
Okay, so whether you're in that area or you'd like him to come and publicly speak, or whether you'd like him to do a Zoom talk, because
Mhm.
that reaches around the world with no barriers or boundaries whatsoever. But
Mhm.
this is, we need to learn. We need to learn because it
Mhm.
explains so much about where we are today, but it also explains how we need to move forward tomorrow. And so
Mhm.
the more we know, again, the more you're aware, the more you care, and the more we become, inspiration begets invitation. So when you're inspired by
Mhm.
something, it invites you to want to do something. And we
Mhm.
want to kind of give a surge of people to go and do something, because
Mhm.
we really are looking at a society around the world right now that is so caught up in the drama of the last few years,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? Um, and the unsurety of what's going on today or tomorrow,
Mhm.
that they become stuck. But if you understand what has been achieved
Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
past during crises like this, it kind of gives you the tools and the ammunition to actually deal with what you're dealing with now and being able to move
Mhm.
forward. So
Mhm.
learn from your history. It will help you in your present. So
Yes.
thank you so much for writing the books and for sharing here today. This has been absolutely fascinating. I've learned so much. And at the same time, it's such a reminder for all of us to actually understand what we need to know and how we can empower ourselves by learning through history. Why is it relevant? Because it affects every single one of us in our daily lives. If
Yeah.
you've been to a hospital, if you've been to a doctor, even if you deal with holistic people,
Mhm.
the history is there. Learn
Mhm.
about it because it will have an effect. So thank you so much for being with us here today.
And thank you very much, Sarah, for having me. I very much enjoyed this conversation.
Wonderful. So until next time, folks, learn from the past to understand your present, to know what you do in the future. Bye for now.
All right. Goodbye.
We hope that you enjoyed the show. There are so many more for you here on selfdiscoverywisdom.com. Just go to the podcast tag at the top there and you will see all the many genres and all 3,000 shows ready for your listening. We are here to serve you, to help you on your journey of life, and we know that through inspiration it begets invitation. We are supported by you, the listeners, and those that we interview. Anything that you can spare us in donation would be greatly accepted, and we do hope that you enjoy the next show.